I suppose I should start by explaining what I even mean when I ask this question. Dark Souls 1's intro is pretty interesting to me in that it isn't really doing the same thing that the second and third game's intros do. Dark Souls 2 is a game about the undead curse. It's about the effects that the curse has on the world and its people, and it's also about the manner in which people succumb to the curse. And so it makes sense then that Dark Souls 2's intro is about that very thing. In the broadest possible terms, it's a depiction of the process of hollowing. Dark Souls 3 is about the end of the Age of Fire, and it's about how different groups react to that end. More than any other game before it, Dark Souls 3 is about dissent. No one wants to link the fire anymore, not even the old Lords of Cinder, who exist quite obviously to mirror the player and make you question your own actions. And again, all of that is reflected in the introduction. It is essentially there to tell you that the fire is fading, and no one is coming to link it anymore. Dark Souls 1's intro is different though. It's a lot more expository. It spends most of its time establishing the events and rules of the world. And for the first game in a series, that makes sense. But the game's central question, that is, the question being asked of you, is almost entirely absent from the text of this cutscene. Sure, there are moments of symbolism and subtext here and there that'll make more sense once you understand the lore, but the point of this cutscene, broadly, is to explain the history and events of the world, not to make you start wondering if the Age of Dark is a good choice. Now, I'm not saying that's strictly a bad thing. Obviously, in the version of Dark Souls 1 that shipped, the idea that anyone might want the fire to fade is positioned as a kind of twist. It wouldn't really have made sense to just come out and say it. But in this video, I want to spend some time asking what this intro accomplishes, and why it is the way it is. Dark Souls occupies an interesting spot in the gaming landscape. It straddles the line between narrative-driven and almost entirely devoid of narrative. Something more conventionally narrative-driven, like The Last of Us, provides a good point of contrast. The Last of Us is a story about Ellie and Joel and Abby, and you play as Ellie and Joel and Abby while they take part in the major events of the story. The story takes place and is told to you as you progress through the game. But Dark Souls, and in particular Dark Souls 1, just isn't like that. This opening cutscene establishes the most important characters in the narrative. These are your Ellies and your Joels, but by the time the game begins, they've already made all of the important decisions they're going to make. They've already done all of the important things. When you escape from the Undead Asylum, the story of Dark Souls is almost over. It's already happened. But it hasn't already been told. The story is told by the world and its NPCs. The actual quest your character goes on is incredibly bare bones. It's less of a plot and more of a series of high-stakes errands, during which there's next to no character development or meaningful change to be observed in the central narrative. But that's okay, because those errands aren't the story of Dark Souls. This is the story of Dark Souls, and that story is told to you by the world as you explore it. At the very end of the game, you finally get to enter this narrative and are responsible for choosing how it ends. I want to reiterate, I don't think this is a bad thing. Every Soulsborne game operates off of this foundation. But I do think subsequent games in the series focus more on building the story around your character and letting you take part in its important events. The high watermark for that is, I think, Dark Souls 3. See, it's tempting to say that Dark Souls has no story, just a lot of detailed lore, but I don't think that's quite true, because there are moments throughout the game when your character is given agency and power to shape those events. It's not a great definition, but narrative can be understood in Dark Souls as the degree to which your character gets to interact with all of the cool shit that Vaati talks about. Dark Souls 2 takes a lot of steps in the right direction, but Dark Souls 3 I think succeeds where both prior entries fail. The Lords of Cinder are the most important figures in the lore, just like the old lords in the other games, but the lords of Dark Souls 1 and 2 were done making decisions, they were done affecting the story. And so getting to kill them didn't feel like it broke that barrier between lore and narrative. But the Lords of Cinder in Dark Souls 3 are still kicking when you show up. They've still got opinions, they've still got goals. They've got their own ideological projects that contradict your own. They aren't just characters in a story you can't reach, they remain characters in the part of the story that you play through. I think that also has to do with the decreased emphasis on retrospective framing. If Dark Souls 1 is a novel, then the part of the story you're in is like the last 2 pages. If Dark Souls 2 is a novel, well then maybe it's a whole chapter. In Dark Souls 3, though, it's probably close to half the book. The difference, really, is that most of Dark Souls 3's key players are still around and still doing the important shit during the part of the game that you play through. In Dark Souls 2, I'd say it was limited more to Aldia and Nashandra, who were both pretty hands-off in their approach. All that to say, Dark Souls 1 isn't about your character, and it's also not really about different political factions, at least not to the same degree as the third game. It's a story about its world, and the intro reflects that. That being said, I think the way the ancient dragons are portrayed does serve as an interesting bit of thematic subtext. Before there was fire, the world was unchanging, shrouded by fog, home to arch trees and everlasting dragons. Gwyn and the other lords band together to usurp the dragons and establish their own age, which at least according to the narration marks the actual beginning of the Age of Fire. However, we know that their conquest was not as complete as they made it out to be. Some ancient dragons survived, and all throughout Lordran can be seen their descendants, drakes and half-dragons. And it's these malformed dragonkin that I find interesting, because it's implied that what twisted and corrupted them was fire and the change that accompanied it. They were unchanging beings, but the world was now defined by change. Essentially, the ancient dragons are in the wrong world, and that leads them down this path of degradation. Gwyn's motivations in linking the fire were anything but selfless, but perhaps he foresaw a similar fate in the coming Age of Dark. This is kind of an aside, but I still think it's worth talking about because I found it really interesting. I learned about this in a Kierzy video, so all the credit goes to her. But in an earlier draft of Dark Souls 1, Oscar was meant to survive the Undead Asylum and reappear throughout the game, eventually confronting you before the kiln of the First Flame, at which point he would choose whichever ending you had rejected. If you planned to link the fire, he would embrace the dark, and if you planned to snuff out the flames, he would fight to defend them. And I don't think it's difficult to see how this version of Oscar would have served a role in the story very similar to the Lords of Cinder in Dark Souls 3. He would have been a character who disagrees with you, somebody who you fight not merely because he used to be important, but because the two of you are at odds, because you disagree about what ought to be done, how the problem should be solved. The best battles in fiction are clashes of ideals, and I think it's a good thing that FromSoft has started to move more towards that style of storytelling. Anyways, that's about all I've got for you. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch my video. I hope you all stay safe, and may the flames guide your way.